do it each round, but I imagine you've heard it a lot of times over this tournament. So really quickly, everyone, hello and welcome to round 6 of the New Zealand Schools Debating Nationals. Today we have Auckland Blue on the affirmative, and we have Hawke's Bay on the negating. The motion today is this House would institute a land value tax. I remind both teams that speech times are 8 minutes. I will give you a clap at 1 minute and a clap at 7 minutes to open and close POIs. I will give you 2 claps at 8 minutes, 3 claps at 8:15. If you're still speaking at 8:15, please wrap it up because we like the tournament running to time as it has done so far. Speech times for Lee's replies are 4 minutes. I'll give you a clap at 3 minutes, 2 claps at 4 minutes, 3 claps at 4:15. There'll be no POIs during Lee's replies. Unless there are any questions or concerns, we can get the debate underway. So without further ado, I will invite the first speaker from the affirmative bench to come and open today's debate.
This coalition government wants to fund their budget by giving a lot of people lung cancer. What we would tell you, there are so many better ways to fund your budget with so many better flow-on effects for the people in society, and for those reasons we should propose. I'm going to do 2 things in the speech. First, on why we incentivize development on land on our side. Second, why we make low-cost housing far more accessible. But before that, what do we support? 2 broad parts of our model. Firstly, as to how land gets valued, we think it's just going to be very basic things like the location of the land, the size of the land, or how socially utile the land is. For instance, if it could be used for farming or for like the development of roads, those can all impact the value of the land. What do we support in terms of how the tax system is implemented in? Our tax system would be a progressivist system similar to how capital gains taxes work in other countries. That is, if you have a lower income, then for the same plot of land, you would have a lower tax rate for the same plot of land. But this system would work based on like the income of the tenant or the primary user of that land. That's how we would implement this. Now then, before I move on to explain why we incentivize the development of land, I'll take a point.
How would land in Hawke Bay benefit from housing development?
I don't quite understand that specific POI. I think it doesn't just have to be housing development. There's also other development that you could use with land. That's what we're going to explain right now. How do we incentivize development of land then? The context here is that in the status quo, the appreciation of land means that it's very lucrative to hold on to them for very long periods of time. This is because firstly, people need places to live in the future, and hence if you just keep large plots of land, it's very profitable towards you. But secondly, it's a tangible asset which makes people like it far more. It's like a house that they can associate with their childhood, or maybe it's passed down from their grandpa and it's very meaningful to them subjectively. Thirdly, it's a very big status symbol for individuals to own houses, which means they want to keep, or own land, which means they want to hold on to it. What does this incentive make landowners do then? Firstly, they hold onto the land for long periods of time without developing it to a large extent. This is because the profitability of developing your land is very uncertain in the short term, and so it's far preferable to just hold onto the land, let it appreciate, and then sell it off later for a far higher cost. Secondly, it can keep inheritance properties for far longer periods of time. People just want to hold on to this generational wealth as their own status symbol, but just note the things about nostalgia I mentioned before. But note a lot of this thing about inheritance properties is that they were left over from a time where people built houses with excessively large plots of land. This looks like a very small house with a massive backyard that is very incredibly wasteful in terms of how the land ought to be used. What are the harms of this then? Firstly, there's a low supply of land overall, which artificially increases land prices. We're going to explain later on how that can be bad for housing for low-income individuals, but overall, it just means that less land can be developed for far more utile things, like roads, like pedestrian infrastructure, for instance, and that can be incredibly harmful for urban development more broadly. Why are people likely to develop their land on side affirmative then? Firstly, it is unnecessarily large plots of lands become incredibly expensive to keep up. That's just because, for instance, excessively large backyards backyards become way more expensive to keep as part of your property. So maybe you just sell off half of your backyard to like develop, because that means you halve your expenses in the form of this land tax. And what this means is that developers are able to buy up this land at cheaper rates because the incentive is to sell it off, and they can use it to develop for other things. For instance, they can like increase the number of roads in a region. They can build busways on that land, or they can like build like pedestrian infrastructure that keeps people safer when they're walking. Secondly, investments in large properties just become less profitable. This is because the government can do other things that protect renters, for instance, like cap rent prices, which makes rental properties less profitable overall. Or secondly, like if they decide to just not rent out their land, then this unused land just becomes less lucrative compared to other investment sources. For instance, like stocks or like other things that people can invest in. Thirdly, I think the government sends a very strong signaling effect that they very much dislike undeveloped land, and this signaling effect is very important for landowners to like become incentivized insofar as they draw a lot of their inspiration from what the government says and supports. So having a lot of this, having the signaling effect makes people want to develop to a far greater extent. What is the outcome of here then? First, I think the outcome here is that land gets used far more efficiently overall. This is just because there are more incentives to like sell their land to the government, as we outlined previously. But the way this can play out in society is it looks like things like the benefits to the average users of everyone else that we mentioned before, just like having more space to work with, having more houses built up in certain regions, but it can also just have a very strong economic impact. For instance, small businesses can now buy up these lands and raise up their own like buildings to be able to sell their own goods. And this is very good for the economic like sphere of this place, insofar as like the rent prices for business buildings just decreases substantially, and it increases the jobs in the region. I think this is very important here, just because land, when it's unused, becomes a very large liability for governments, which is why we like prefer to just develop it to a far greater extent. Before I move on to explain why low-cost housing makes it more accessible, I'll take it.
Would you also stand for like a wealth tax or capital gains tax?
I don't think that's in the context of this debate, but like we're probably happy to support that on similar grounds, that it just increases revenue as such. Okay, making low-cost housing more accessible. The premise here is that homeowners are incentivized to do two things. Firstly, sell their land, which allows for housing development more specifically. Secondly, they want to rent out more houses, which frees up other housing. Why do they want to sell more land then? Firstly, I think we've already explained this sufficiently before, just like they save costs by reducing the size of land. But specifically, housing development is one that is very profitable currently, which means they're the ones who are most likely to buy this land in the first place. And this is where you're able to get far more single unit housing, or like far more like multi-unit housing, depending on what the specific region wants. But what it means, it just means more housing available. And the reason why this is good for lower income people, even if they're not the ones who are able to afford this, is because other people are now able to move into these slots, which can free up other forms of housing, for instance, like state housing as such. But also notice here that this tax revenue can be used to subsidize these kinds of buildings, which makes it far cheaper for these, like specifically, the specific context of many countries. They're living in a housing crisis. When we're able to help them alleviate this risk by increasing the amount of warm homes that people can go to, that's really meaningful. Secondly, why are they likely to rent it out like more so? Firstly, I think when you rent out your property, you're able to recuperate a lot of the tax that you otherwise would have lost. And this is really important because a lot of people just irrationally hold onto their houses for sentimental value. For instance, maybe they have like a grandpa's inheritance like property that they want to go to every single summer to hang out with their family, but otherwise for the rest of the year it would be left unused. Here, we want to rent it out because, or else they'll just lose a significant money due to this land tax. But secondly, I think like lower income families will just like lower income tenants, for instance, can just have reduced like rents, for instance, premised on our characterization in the model and to like into the progressivist system. That means the incentives of these homeowners become to like rent their properties out to lower income people if it means that they have to pay less land tax, and this helps a lot of people just get homes than they otherwise wouldn't. This helps them go into wealthier areas with better schooling and better zoning laws that mean that when they otherwise wouldn't, just because the incentives are to like rent out to like lower income people. What are the outcomes here then? I think firstly, it's just more housing, and I want to explain why this is super important for the individuals who now get a home as a result. Because when you're on the street in Auckland and people are walking by you, ignoring your existence, it becomes really harmful. It becomes really emotionally struggling. You lose out on your sense of identity. When we have more housing, because the incentives of these homeowners are just to allow people to build more, what happens is you can feel like a human again. You can go home every single day to a warm bed, and you can feed your children and send them to places that they otherwise wouldn't be able to go. The weighing here is that these people are just the most vulnerable people in the society. They otherwise would not have warm homes. We'd rather sacrifice the benefits of wealthier individuals. Propose.
I thank the speaker for what was an excellent speech. I now invite the first speaker of the side negating to come up and open their team's case.
Affirmative tells you that they do not stand for poor people owning land. 3 substantive points from our side. Firstly, on how you harm specific landowners. Secondly, on how you use the land changes. And thirdly, Isabella will provide you an extension on how you further, this further affects stakeholders, right? But before I get into any framing or substantives, I think a general piece of response to what we've had so far, right? What's the general push been? I think that there's been this characterization that oh, you can just I don't know, keep the land or rent it out or stuff like that. But I think the problem starts when you're not able to afford the tax that is put on this land, right? This means that you have to sell it, which is bad for you because you have connections to this land, and but also I think that it's just unrealistic for these people to just be able to use this land effectively. I think I'll get more onto this in my point, and I'll flag it when I do. But moving on to my point and how this harms specific landowners, right? And on framing, I think this debate isn't ultimately about increasing government revenue, but in the status quo, we can do things such as increasing the tax to a higher tax bracket, so that you get more income for the highest income levels, right? Note what this looks like is this is different from income tax, which is taken out of the money that you earn and you tax unrealized gains, right? I think that also, in order for you to get away with substantial benefits, you have to stand for a higher tax, which is something that some of the very low income stakeholders in this debate cannot afford, and therefore are really harmed by. But firstly, on how you harm specific landowners. For context, I think owning land is generally generally not reflective of your wealth. 3 reasons why this is. Firstly, what are these vulnerable people likely to look like? We're talking about poor people who have this land through inheritance or birthright. This looks like small agriculture families who have been owning this land and farming in it for 100 years. This looks like indigenous people who are guarding this land. They are still poor because of generations of families not being able to maximize land in order to develop it further for profit, right? I think this looks like farmers doing lots of manual labor because they can't afford tractors to plant all of these seeds. This looks like indigenous people not being able to get wealthier and maximize, therefore because of systemic racism, which leads them further into poverty. For example, Iwi Māori or Native American reserves. I think that this is extremely crucial. But then secondly, on poor and vulnerable people are probably the most impacted, because while they can likely succeed in maximizing the value of land, e.g. like building housing or like apartment complexes, so they can use the money to pay the land value tax, right? I think the most important stakeholder that is impacted is the people who can't afford it and therefore have to make drastic like decisions in order to like stay stable, right? But on the comparative, if you are poor and vulnerable, you're unable to like maximize the value of your land that you own, and you are most impacted, right? And then thirdly, what does this impact look like? We think that you get less disposable income that you can spend on like necessities such as food and mortgage and car insurance, because like you can't afford this. This is what I've already flagged to you in my rebuttal on why this is unrealistic, right? This may result in you not being able to afford these payments when you can't make them. You like, for example, you lose your car, you lose your ability to go to work, you lose like, and then so you put like your like position at your job in jeopardy because you weren't able to like afford this like tax, right? On the other hand, you either are like suffering while like trying to pay this tax, or you are like you are so desperate that you have to sell your property in order to avoid like the land value tax, right? This is really bad for a vulnerable actor because they have to sell like their farms, they have to send like their land as like leverage to get loans from like banks, because land is an asset. So when you no longer are able to do this, you're no longer to like take out more loans. This is extremely crucial when like people want to take out loans for like medical bills or unis. They're unable to do this. You're unable to like go to a better university in America because of the loans that you've taken out. I think farmers take out loans the most during like economic downfalls, like droughts, right? And they still have to yield, which is bad because they have to like carry out all these operations like feeding your cows, and now they're not able to do that. That means their farm gets worse, their quality of life gets worse because they're not able to do this. This is extremely harmful, something that the Affirmative stands for, and something in which this inequality gets deeper and deeper on their side. But then also, on my second point, on how the use of this land changes, right? I think this is quite like responsive to all the material they give on how like this land use can be extremely efficient, right? When you're paying annually for land, you're incentivized to make more land profit, right? As they've told you. But I think that like when you're not able to do this, this is made like ineffective in your attempts to try like develop this land, right? Not that all people are capable of doing this, but like I think like people are incentivized to do this. So what this actually means is like you build like small little houses in a small little plot of land in Wairapara, which is like really far away from like the central city, like, right? So what this means is that you build like some houses in a small area where like most of like the urbanization doesn't even exist yet, and so you make all these houses really farther away. You contribute to urban sprawl, which means that you live further away from existing infrastructure that we have. That means that government has to spend more like money on like road networking, and this is a more tense task for them to do because it means that they have just like more things to deal with. I think most of like unused land like likely does not exist in the city, right? Most of this land that is unused and like this big land is likely not going to be right in the middle of the city. So you're likely to have to make more networks and roads to like make this land more accessible, right? But then secondly, on those who can't develop and are forced to sell it, we think that what this results in is like when land being consolidated by the richest and most wealthiest of the population, who are only like the top, like, I don't know, 10%. So that's not obviously on scale, that's not a huge amount of people. And like this is like it's extremely bad for the most number of people. So when you're unable to like, the people that are unable to pay things like significant land tax are like disproportionately like harmed by this. We think that oftentimes that the people who are buying this land are like overseas developers. This is extremely bad because the land doesn't stay within the communities that is most impacting. It means the value of the like increased rent doesn't go towards the communities. It doesn't go back to government for redistributions. The inequalities deepen further. We tell you like some land also should not be developed for profits, like, I don't know, like par sites or rural or rural par, because it's like really culturally significant. What this means is A, you either commercialize it to appeal to like tourists, which is like the westernization of culture, and this means that like indigenous people like their like culture disintegrates. But also secondly, you have to sell it, and like this is just extremely bad for you, because then the people who've bought this land don't understand it. What this means is a lot of people get disconnected from their home clan and their culture, and they feel isolated, and this has drastic effects on generations of people, on your people. This is extremely bad, an outcome that side negative cannot stand for.
All right, thank the speaker for what was an exceptional speech. I was going to use fine again, sorry guys. And I invite the second speaker from side of Affirmative to come continue their discourse.
It is really important that we have land that is developed, that we don't have blank pieces of land, we don't have 10 acres of land in New Zealand sitting there overgrown, being not used when it could be used for more efficient, when it could be maximized for other things that are really good for people to live in, or maybe just for the overall economy, to do things like farming, like, you know, like have sheep as your pet. Okay. Two things in my speech, then first I'll be responding, and then second I'll be extending our case on rent. So first on the stuff about that they bring us, about how like the problem starts when you can't afford rent. I think that they failed to engage with the like model that we gave to you. We framed this out because we tell you that the tax is going to be progressive. What this means is that you have the tax on the land with like depending on the value of like the land, the like social utility, but you also have an extra factor that is also considered, which is the income of the tenant, the primary user of the land. What this means then is that if you have someone who does lack income, who is like, you know, quite poor, it means that they're on the lower end of that progressive tax. They don't have to pay as much tax. They don't face such tangible harm. But second of all, they tell you that it's really bad when they have to sell their land because they have ties to it. Because we frame to you as being progressive, it means that it's not that they can't afford it, it's just that it's less profitable and relatively less affordable for them to keep this land. It means that they can probably still keep the land, they just have to spend more money, but this money is probably better directed if they sell the land and spend it on other things. What this means then is that if they really have such historical and significant ties to this land, if they really feel bonded with their grandparent through this land, they're still able to keep it as long as they are, as a person, are willing to make the trade-off between keeping this land and having to spend few extra thousands of dollars on the tax every year. They then tell you that poor people can have land during inheritance because land and wealth are not symmetrical. The first response to this then is that land can often be actually a sign of wealth because it means that it's like a source of generational income. When you have a house that is passed down to you, it means that you don't have to pay mortgages. It means that a whole chunk of your stretch is just bought out. In the status quo, if you don't have a house, if you were a first generation person who now buys a house, you basically have to spend your entire life up to retirement having to pay off that mortgage. This is a big thing that prevents you from earning a lot of money. That's why often having a large chunk of land is a big sign of having a lot of wealth. But second of all, they talk to you about farmers and stuff. I think our progressive framing just models this out as in they're able to afford this tax because, like, you know, they don't earn a lot, which means that we don't tax them a lot. Before I move on, I'll take your point.
How do the homeless in Auckland benefit from suburban development in Northland?
I think that this is kind of ridiculous because obviously if they're in Auckland, they're not going to benefit because they are separate from Northland. But also, it means that you get the people who are in Auckland benefiting from the stuff that happens in Auckland. You get a lot of change, like you have land that develops in Auckland because there are a lot of rich people who are able to sell their houses, able to utilize it for better things. Bruce explained all of this to you very, very well in his speech. This actually wasn't engaged to at all by the FASF. I think that's what they need to actually deal with. Then they tell us that like there's less disposable income for low income people to spend on other things. Note that their entire case basically hinges on the idea that poor people are unable to afford this tax. What this then also implicitly implies is that the entire case relies on the idea that poor people actually have houses to begin with. Note that this tax is being paid by the owners of the land. What this means is that if poor people don't have the houses, they're not paying the taxes. In the status quo, most poor people are not able to afford a house simply because they don't have the money to do so, meaning that most people in the status quo are renters, meaning that they're not paying the tax. The people who are paying this tax in are the people who own the property, meaning that because they like poor people aren't the people who are paying this tax in the first place, their entire case has already failed to engage with this debate. But second of all, even if there are lower income people owning these houses, it means that the progressive tax system simply means they pay less money. This isn't much of a harm. But third of all, in regards to like farmers, if they have land that is unused anyways, it's a bad thing because it's inefficient. When you impose this land tax on them, maybe it's just an extra push for them to realize to maximize the productivity of them. That's probably a good thing. But fourth of all, I think renting actually does get a lot better for poor people in this debate. That's why you should stand with Aff, because poor people don't own houses, they rent, and the changes are what we get in rent. So why do we get changes in rent? And note that this is my substantive contribution. When we have extra tax, like through this thing, like from this land tax, it means that you can go through things like cheap housing, like the subsidies, like state housing that we already mentioned to you. This means that A, rent increases don't impact you because if you're renting, the government can give you subsidies. But also B, rent doesn't matter because if you don't want to rent, you can get state housing since we have an increased capacity to do so. But second of all, it means that the progressive tax, because it's based on like the land itself and the income of the primary user, if you are a low income tenant, then it means that the tax on this property has been decreased. The owner of the property pays this. What this then means is that the owner can simply afford to charge less on this rent but still earn the same profit margin on their rent. Note that this means that low income people, one, find it easier to rent because people are more willing to rent to them, but also second of all, they just find relatively cheaper housing. They have access to things like food and healthcare, like the disposable income stuff that Negating brings to you. But third of all, it means that for owners, they're more incentivized to rent houses to low income. Like Bruce explained to you, they are able to increase their profit margin while still decreasing rent because the amount they decrease by, as long as the amount they decrease the rent by is less than the amount of tax that has been reduced, then they're still earning more. Note that this doesn't contradict with the material above about the stuff because they're still able to have decreased prices. But fourth of all, on middle class people then. Middle class people are still able to rent and it is symmetric for them. Why is this? Because they are the type of people who can either one, rent or two, buy a house. Then first touching on these people who rent. The people who rent probably do so because like maybe one, houses are expensive, or second, mortgages are very stressful. Maybe third, they just don't want to deal with having to maintain a house. Even with progressive, this doesn't change because the middle class is probably where the tax is most likely to be symmetric. What this means is that even if the rent they have to pay is now slightly more expensive because of the progressive tax, they're still able to afford this. But secondly, on the people on middle class who are on the edge of buying the house, at the point at which the land tax is implemented, like Bruce explained to you that a lot of people are selling land. This means that there's more land to buy, it's more affordable because there's more houses in the market. There are probably going to be more in middle income people where this is a tipping point for them because now it's relatively more affordable. They're able to buy. This means that there's less renting, and because there's less renters, like the people who are renting the houses out essentially have to lower their prices. That's pretty obvious. But finally, if more people want to rent now, it means that there's like if more people want to rent out their houses to maximize their profit because they're being taxed on otherwise unused houses, on unused pieces of land, it means that there's more options to rent in the market. These people have to lower the prices. Overall, what this means is that for the lower income people in society, when they rent, they pay less money. That's a really good thing. That's the only way we help them. Note that all the material that Neg brought you doesn't stand because poor people most likely rent houses. That's why our material wins us this debate. But then they tell us that like, they're going to move this development to these different places like land, different unvaluable pieces of land. If the location moves to something that's less valuable, the tax just decreases. It means that the low income people just, they aren't bothered. Also, second of all, like even if the land doesn't stay within your communities and moves to more rural areas, the income tax revenue still exists. You're still able to fund this to other things. The final thing they tell us is that land is now taken by the top 5%. One, these are the people who are selling their land because it's unprofitable. Why? Because now they're being taxed. It's more likely that they invest in other things like the stock market, like they go to Goldman Sachs. Maybe they're able to invest in startups, invest in businesses. They're the people who have the capacity to do so, but they're also the people where land is sold, where we get developed land. At the end of this, it's pretty clear the people who are selling houses are the people who are rich. They're able to redirect profits. So because they're doing this, you have decreased rent. You're actually able to help lower income people on out of their house because they're the people who are renting. So proud to affirm.
I thank the speaker for his superb speech. I now invite the second speaker from the Negating bench to come up and continue their team's case. Get there.
At the point in which they tell you that their tax is going to operate basically like a wealth tax, they might as well do so. We tell you that on our side of the house, we told you from First Affirming that we stand for something that more targets the rich directly by increasing the toppest progressive tax rate. All of their outcomes are just based on rich people suffering, which we can do regardless. We can, if you're trying to get people to develop their land more, we can get rich people to do that and try to make more income just by taxing them more and by taxing the highest wealth bracket more. I think that also furthermore, they're they're not directly addressing the motion, as it tells you specifically it is based on the value of the land. What do I think they have to stand for then? I think they have to stand for every piece of land being taxed based on the value of it, the sort of things they were maybe telling you about location and also the size of the land. I think therefore that all the reasons we've given you about how this is going to negatively affect poor people and result in no change to the way in which rich people use land still exists in this debate. So a few things I'm going to talk about. Firstly, who currently owns land? Why do we hold on to land? Do we develop it? Secondly, who changes as a result? Thirdly, where specifically is this change? And then I'll be talking about maybe other subsidies and the specific impact on climate change. Firstly, they tell you that people who own land are typically rich, and they do this, A, because it's a status symbol. I don't think that land or housing is particularly strong as a status symbol because you generally hate the rich and the majority of society is poor anyway. You condemn those who are doing much better off than you. But secondly, we tell you it's not just really a physical benefit. I'm not going to hold on to a house that is really costing me a lot year in and year out to maintain and to pay rates on. So obviously I don't really care that much that it maybe offers me a slight status symbol gain. Secondly, but what you do care about, or why you might be likely to actually effectively use this land, is because you have to still pay rates on it, you have to still maintain it, you much rather at least do something with it, but critically you do something with it if you are able to do so. This means that you must have significant income or other assets that make you rich, but also mean that you're able to develop this land. I think what this means is that regardless of whether or not you have a tax on land value, either you have people who don't care either way about rates, they don't care about land taxes, they don't change on either side, right? Or you get poor people who are just able to plan ahead to pay for rates, pay for maintenance, who now suffer as a result because there's an extra charge that they couldn't account for. Secondly, they tell you that maybe it's not status symbol, maybe people are really connected to the land. But they never tell you then why it's a good thing that we break that connection and get people moving or selling their land or halving its value. I think it's really bad because you likely have like cultural connection to that land at the point at which you're like indigenous, and it's really bad, as we've seen historically with like the urbanization of Māori, when you lose your language, you lose access to your elders to share your stories and pass that on to you, and you lose any sort of like cultural connection and value, and you feel really isolated. But likely you've also been like a caretaker of that land, and you're probably going to be better at looking after it and maintaining it for future generations than like some overseas property developer who's never even visited New Zealand. Before I move on, I'll take that POI.
If poor people are the people who rent most houses instead of buying them, why does the land tax affect them in any way?
Because it's not all rent, like it's firstly, I'll get onto this later, but in general, some poor people do own land because they are indigenous to the land, because they are farmers who have held it for decades. Or we are also caring about like future poor people and their ability to like buy land in the future, right? And the point to which you make that more expensive, you make it more difficult for poor people to own land. And I've explained to you, it's really important for poor people to own land because it means that at the point in which you have an asset in order to pay like a leverage against your loans, in which you are able to like, once you retire, you've paid off your mortgage, you're able to pass something on to your kids in order to continue to survive. I think those are things that we should really care about in this debate. But I think at the end of that point, what you have to believe, therefore, is that people don't just like own land for the sake of owning land and not utilize it, right? There are other incentives as to why they're likely to develop it. And this means that you uniquely harm poor people on their side of the house, who now there is another incentive, they're even more at risk of those sorts of things. Moving on to then, like who changes as a result of this? I think what they've tried to tell you, right, is that what they've tried to tell you is that there's another incentive. Okay, I'm going to do things like break up my land, or maybe I like build another house, or I rent something out. Firstly, in order to now rent out the house, this must mean that you have to own another house already. At that point, you're probably rich. You're probably able to like maximize things like rent anyway. You're able to like pay bonds and ensure that you can upkeep and maintain the house for renters in order to be able to use. But furthermore, we tell you that you also must have a lot of land if you're able to like subdivide it, so that uniquely again, when poor people are the ones who are like suffering and are likely to change as a result of this motion, they probably, maybe they need that land, or they don't change, or they lose out as a result, and that they halve that land, they can't use it to back up their loans and their incomes. I think what they also tell you then is that it signals to people, the government basically is using this as a signalling mechanism in order to develop more land, therefore we get more land development. I think firstly, there's just a lot of miscellaneous taxes going around, and you're like, I've got like GST coming off of my oranges, I don't really know why, surely that's good for me to be buying oranges, right? But secondly, people don't go and look at tax policies or debates and like get really in depth about the politics of it. Like, I'm not sitting there watching Parliament TV on a Thursday night. I don't really understand why the tax has been implemented. They've given us no reason to do that. I think rather what you end up doing is you go, oh, well, no, it's just because the government's suffering and they need a bit of money for something, but they don't really show me like a flow chart of where the money's going. I just have to accept the tax. You're not going to be incentivizing development purely just by taxing land. Also, furthermore, I think that the changes that you get as a result of this are specifically the cultural developments that I spoke about, but also you get changes in that people have to sell their homes. They told you that maybe this is like a good thing and that you get fewer people owning homes. But what does this mean to a poor person, right? I sell my home, which was my only home. I now have to go and rent somewhere else, which is an incurring cost that I have to burden every single week. My home then goes to someone who is an overseas developer who has an interest just to purely make profit. All of the like benefits of like rent going back into a community and like staying within your country, such as New Zealand, now go overseas. The government can't tax that money and they can't use it to benefit your community further. I think that's really bad. I think we shouldn't have poor people being forced to sell their land simply because they are poor. Lastly then, on where is the change specifically? I think they aren't able to claim that it is going to be like Auckland Central, we're suddenly going to massively intensify further. What we get is urban sprawl, because that is the kind of places where there are like large properties and back gardens, places like farms, which also, to note, a really important right for like food and development and feeding our nation. But it also means that if they get any housing development on their side of the house, the majority of it just occurs in the middle of nowhere, right? I think this is really bad, both for like society and the government, who now have to like build another house, like another like hospital in the Wairarapa, for example, or you have to like build a long road to get there, which you aren't able to maintain. which means the poor people that they claim to care about now suffer because they can't get to their work, they can't get to their jobs, they don't have any access to healthcare, the schools are really bad, and you end up cancelling the bus services anyway, apparently, according to this government. I think what this means, therefore, is that people suffer on their side of the house even if they get housing development, because the housing development you get is so bad and even has the potential to harm the environment.
Okay, thank the speaker for what was an outstanding speech. I now invite the third speaker from the affirmative bench to come up and continue their team's case.
The biggest cost for the most vulnerable people in society is always going to be the cost on housing, the cost of paying rent, the cost of paying mortgage. That is the thing that we decrease on our side of the house. That is the most important benefit for the people who need it the most. 3 things in my speech. Firstly on land development, secondly on landowners, and thirdly on renters. So, firstly on land development. What have we heard just like broadly at the top level of this debate in response to, what did we tell you in our model? We told you that we're going to be valuing this land tax based on like the land value itself in terms of the location, in terms of the utility for society, in terms of the size, and we also tell you that it's going to be progressive, and in the sense that it's going to be progressive based on the income of the tenant. That is still based on the value of the land. That is to say that they cannot get up at Second Ave and tell you that it is not going to be based on the land on our side. We are still basing it on the land. We're just adding in a progressive element. It is still within the motion. They are unable to say that. We just have the fiat to do this. I think it's unclear of them to say why otherwise. They also just tried to claim to you that a wealth benefit just at a top level has all the same levels of effects. I think at the level at which we gave you specific mechanisms as to why specifically disincentivizing people to do things with their land specifically is able to do this is unclear. But also, like, if they want to support a wealth tax, we can also support a wealth tax. It's very unclear why this is mutually exclusive. It's also very unclear. They've undercooked this. They haven't specifically said why they can co-opt any of our benefits. It's much too late in the debate for them to come out and do that now. So then, what have we told you on land development? We told you that in the status quo, people hold on to a lot of land because it's a very profitable investment that tends to go up because everyone needs places to live, which means that land is never going, like houses are never going to like stop being valuable in the status quo. That means then that it's a profitable investment to go into. We also told you that it's a generational form of wealth and a status symbol of wealth because that means that you are able to show that you have these tangible assets in that sense. What did they tell us in response? They told us that you're likely to develop the land anyway. I think that's very unclear insofar as we told you right at first that it is very uncertain in the short term whether you're going to be able to do that in a profitable way, and also when the kind of people who own it are the intergenerational wealth snowballing, which means that this is the kind of person who is unlikely to want to do that. I think that when it is very profitable to just hold on to that land and wait for it to double in 10 years, that is the kind of thing that you are much more likely to do, much more incentivized to do than invested in uncertain development. I think that where we change that on our side is that we've told you that it is more expensive to keep that land on our side. It is a worse investment option on our side when you have to pay extra benefits. They've tried to tell us in response to this that you have to pay rates, so you're probably don't care anyway. I think that first of all, that is specific to New Zealand. Lots of countries don't have rates. This is not a place set debate. I think that is unclear why it's specifically a good response. But also even if there are rates already, this is a significant increase for the rich people who are really increasing in land. Maybe they're willing to pay rates, but now a significant portion of them, it is less profitable to invest and more profitable to invest in other things, like shares, like we told you at second, like was never responded to. But also then, we told you that it's cheaper to subdivide your profit. Say that if you have a large backyard, you are now going to take off a bit of it in terms of development, in terms of selling that land so that it can be used as housing. Like, that is true. What did they tell us in response under land development? Oh yeah, we also told you that there was a signaling effect, to which they only responded to this idea that you're going to condemn the rich already. I think that is just like not true insofar as people like having money, like having like value. I think that like the rich are kind of glorified in terms of like the success. I think that the point at which we are condemning this unhelpful use of land is the point at which there is a significant signaling effect. That is the case. What do they try to tell us in response? They try to like tell us that people are unable to like develop the land, at which point they kind of concede that there are incentives to develop the land, but also like I think it's unclear at the point at which if you don't develop your land, if you are these kind of big people who are telling you are the ones with that like land development, this looks like people who are just investing a whole lot. That looks like them selling it to companies who will develop it. I think it's very unclear why that is the case. I think that when there are huge people with lots and lots of land that is undeveloped, unused, unused, that is the point at which they are able to develop it. I think that the point at which you are a small person living in a house is the point at which you would never going to be developing it. That was not what we were trying to prove to you in this debate today. Secondly, they told us that urban sprawl happens. I think it was unclear why that is bad, insofar as like if it is profitable to build houses, to build infrastructure, like if that is the profitable thing for them to do, that is just good. Insofar as we get more infrastructure, we get more houses, more like the housing crisis is a big problem. When people are able to move into these houses, that's just really, really good. I think that it's like unclear why that's bad. But also then they try to tell us about the development of cultural sites. I think that insofar as there's like a lot of community support of cultural sites, of things like park sites, I think that you're probably unlikely to develop those things in terms of the fact that there are like charities. The government is unlikely to want to like have these sites developed. There are like people who will go out and protest if you are going to develop that thing. I think it's unclear why this was the biggest impact in the debate. Even if that is a big impact, we are willing and able to trade that off if it means we get better development, if it means we fix the housing crisis. I think that means that at the end of that point, we do get development from the big people who would otherwise have lots of land because it is a good investment, but now they are less incentivized to keep that land. Other alternatives are more profitable. Now moving into renters and then onto landowners. So what did we tell you about renters? I think renters. I think that this was largely unresponded to. They didn't actually engage with our mechanisms at second. We told you then three things. Firstly, the fact that like house prices are going to be lower when you have higher supply on the market, which means that lots of people are able to move from like renting to houses, which means that there are less people like looking to rent, which means that renting necessarily goes down because there are less people demanding rent, which means that the prices go up. But also insofar as the fact that you are more incentivized to have poorer tenants, insofar as the progressive like part of our model means that when you have like these poorer tenants, you have to pay less expenses, less land tax. That means that is a necessarily benefit because you are like, then offering cheaper options to the poorer tenants. I think that is a benefit. But also insofar as we told you that we are going to use the revenue to do things such as like rent subsidies, to do things such as like state housing. I think that has a huge benefit to the poorest people in society who cannot afford to own houses. So then I think that what did they try to tell you? They told us that like only the rich rent houses and they're like not going to change that. I think that is just like not very true insofar as like you can have one rental property, you can have two rental properties, but also like insofar as only the rich rent properties, it's probably now cheaper to rent it to poorer people because like I then have to pay land tax. That doesn't actually engage with our mechanism that we gave you insofar as you're incentivized to rent to poorer tenants. So then now I think it's clear then that we benefit the renters at the lowest level of society, but why do we also benefit landowners in terms of like making it more accessible to buy houses? That we told you that at first, that insofar as you get it is less profitable to hold on to the land, you get lots of selling of land, which probably just like looks like you're having greater supply of land because people are no longer holding on to land that they're not going to use. They're selling it to development companies. They're selling it to people who want to build a house. We think that is kind of the thing that just leads to higher supply on the market. I think that is the case. They also they kind of conceded that you get people selling land. I think that just means that there is inherently a lot of supply of land, which means that the price goes down. But also then there is less demand for land insofar as like the kind of person who's buying it up for investment is no longer buying it up for investment, which means that the price of housing just goes down as a whole because there is less demand and there is more supply. So it's simple supply and demand. You get cheaper houses. That is a benefit. What have they tried to tell us in response here? They've kind of just asserted that there are a lot of poor homeowners for like cultural reasons and for like farmers who have held on to it. I think that like even if there are like poor, like a couple of poor homeowners, I think it's unclear why this is the case. For like indigenous communities, there are structural reasons why they don't own a lot of land. I think even if they like, there are some Māori people in New Zealand who own land. This is not a New Zealand place set debate. I think that there are structural reasons why for colonial, like the colonial powers have taken this kind of land from them. Have like the reason they're poor is not because they have land. It's because they do not have anything. They don't have any assets. They are forced to rent at like low prices. I think it's very unclear why this is the kind of person who is like owning land, but also then just saying that like farmers can hold on to land. I think that farmers probably can just like afford to pay this like small extra benefit. If they are the poorest of the poor farmers, it is probably like slightly less of a expense, as we told you in our model, because of the progressiveness. But also then, I think that like at the end of this debate, the clearest thing is that more houses are going to get sold, that there is going to be less demand, less artificial demand, which means that house prices go down, that renting prices go down, that the people who need it most, the most vulnerable people, are going to be able to afford their rent prices, their mortgages.
Thanks for the fantastic speech. I now invite the third speaker of side Negating to come up and continue their team's case.
One minute into the first affirming speech, we asked them a POI, asking why housing development in rural Hawke's Bay is particularly helpful. They conceded that it probably isn't, but that there are other forms of development that could happen. And then for the whole of the case, for 3 full speeches, the only thing they told you about was housing. At the point where in the third affirming speech, at 3 different points, they tell you that housing is the biggest issue, the main issue, and the only issue. We have to win this because they've already conceded that housing development is not beneficial in the majority of areas, right? You have to believe that we get benefits uniquely on our side because we don't just punish people for owning land that wouldn't be developed regardless. So I think generally both teams agree on a lot of what the land tax actually means. So I'll just spend a couple of a short while on what the world actually looks like, and then a lot on weighing and what you should consider the most important. I think first we have this contention on what the motion actually means, because they've tried to tell you that they're gonna have a land tax, but the tax is based on mostly the wealth and income of the person, and then also the value of the land. We tell you that's an extremely uncharitable way of viewing this debate. It doesn't really engage with it, and it just means the majority of the debate doesn't matter, because we tell you that okay, so we'll just do an income tax with a high progressivity, and we probably get the majority of the same benefits, because as we told you at Isabella, the incentive is just to maximize your income. It doesn't matter whether the income is removed from wealth or from just your actual income, right? So what this means is that they, at least for this debate to be reasonable, for this debate to be charitable, and for there to be an actual debate, they have to stand for a world where either the progressivity of the tax is very decreased, so people who do own land but aren't but don't make a lot of money are still affected by it, or they have to remove that idea regardless. And secondly, they just quickly at third told us that there's an incentive to give rent to poorer tenants because it means the tax goes down. I don't there's no part of the motion, there's no part of the model that says what the income of the tenant is determined helps in determining the tax. So I don't think they can claim that at all. I think what we tell you additionally is that people are likely to want to develop this these areas regardless, right? If people care about the money that they lose from the land tax and want to get the money from developing, they probably want to get money regardless, so they just develop anyway if they can. The pushback we hear against this is just saying, oh, but it's risky, so people don't want to do it. If it's risky, then you probably get really bad development, if you force it to happen, because you just have a lot of failing development because it's so risky, right? Or you have people who don't do it regardless because they still think it's risky, but now they're being taxed for not taking a lot of risk. I think that's an unreasonable harm, right? Yeah. Before I move on, I'll take a POI.
The idea with the land tax is that it becomes relatively more affordable now to rent out your house rather than for it. This is why it's a tipping point. Please respond.
Okay, so once again, this is another push on housing, which we've already answered. But just quickly on how the benefit harm of housing, right? I think the big push we hear from them is that because you're incentivized to build more housing or sell your land, you're gonna just get higher supply, lower demand, prices goes down, everyone's happy. And I think this is fine and dandy in debate land, but it doesn't work in the real world because prices are regionally dependent, right? Homeless people in Auckland can't benefit massively from it because I don't see where they can find a lot of new land to develop in Auckland. It's a big city. I don't think New York City can get massive new development, and I don't think they can benefit from renting houses in Albany going down because the homeless people in New York can't just move to Albany on a whim, right? They're homeless. They don't have a car to move. They probably It's entirely unreasonable for them to claim that oh yeah, we're just gonna have higher supply of housing in Hawke's Bay and Northland, so people in people in the big cities who are homeless benefit from that. I think that's entirely unreasonable, right? And I think no. So generally, what they also tell you that they tell you that rich people sell the land, and you don't actually get the congregation of housing and land at the very top. They tell us that they're likely to go for better investment. But we've already told you from Anshika why they are why only the rich are the ones able to buy the land and develop it, right? So if the rich are selling the land to find safer investment, and people don't want to develop the land anyway because it's so risky, I think land isn't developed on either side because no one wants to buy the land and develop it, right? So I don't think they can claim a benefit there, right? And then secondly, it's just what they tell you is that people are just going to just give up their their land, give up their inheritance or the land or the farmland that they've owned and developed as a small business and make it more profitable. I think okay, I don't think that's good for you, right? I think people do really the reason people have a strong connection to the land is the inheritance. The idea is I don't think they can just say, oh, people are gonna do it because we're gonna make them do it and that's good. Come on, you have to cop the harm of people losing their heritage, losing their history, and I don't think they've sufficiently get any benefits, or even if they do, they don't get sufficiently to actually justify their harm though. Now, lastly, on the point of cultural heritage, I think generally this was largely unresponded to throughout the majority of the debate. We have some pushback from third affirming. They just tells us, oh, but native people just don't own land, or maybe they do only in New Zealand, but this is not a regional debate, right? So I think one is we tell you that generally because of the community aspect of them, they are likely to form together and try to buy the land that is specifically important to them, right? So that means that once you have the tax, they're probably not just massively wealthy. They've hoarded a lot of money together to be able to buy that land. At the point where you introduce a massive tax on it, it's unsustainable and they have to commercialize it or sell it. And I think in terms of like it not being a New Zealand debate, this happens in like Native American reservations too. This happens in like other places. I don't think they can just say like just assert, oh, but this is only true in New Zealand, so they can't accept it. I think this like you need to weigh this in really highly, even though the practical benefit might be lower, but just because we have a principal obligation to those people because of the historical harms we've given them, because of the massive harm there.
Speech. We now move to these replies, at which point we reverse speaking orders and cut speech time in half, 4 minutes. So, without further ado, I will invite the leader of Side Negating to come and close their team's case today.
I think there's multiple things that Affirming team had to do to win this debate, and they did basically none of them. Firstly, they had to prove that there's a problem, that people are like hoarding up significant amount of land to the point where it is worth implementing this. Secondly, they had to prove to you that it can only be uniquely solved by a tax that is placed on the land. Thirdly, they had to prove to you that people change their land use in a way that is beneficial, that benefits the most vulnerable people in this debate, and that ultimately we've caught more benefits as a result. Firstly, I'm just going to expand on the point of like, can it only be solved by a land value tax? I think, to be honest, at the point at which they tell you that it's just going to be a progressive tax based on income, they aren't able to prove that uniquely a land value tax is going to be able to cop those same benefits. Why? Because we've told you during this debate that the mechanism of you have less money so you try to like rent out your properties to get more money exists regardless of what the tax is that means that you end up with less money. That means that if you have a like wealth tax or like a greater progressivity in your income tax, we get the exact same benefits on side negating. But furthermore, we tell you that it's just simply unreasonable for the team to claim that it's going to be reliant on income. Like they flip and flop over whether it's tenants or owners. We also give you examples of like communities and indigenous communities that own land. I don't think that this is a valid interpretation of the motion. Moving on to then, is there actually a problem? I think firstly we tell you that most people in like the cases in which they have a large connection to the land and they hold on for it for a while, it is good that they are able to continue to hold on to it, to preserve their cultural heritage, to preserve their connection to the land. They never told us why that's a bad thing. Secondly, we tell you that when it comes to things like maintenance and rates, there are large costs to maintaining land that mean that you don't just leave it empty. But furthermore, we live in a capitalist society, and so people just want to maximize the like value of their properties anyway. If they are rich and able to do so, then we told you that in the status quo, they are already maximizing their properties. They're already renting out their extra properties. They already, like sold off any extra land that they don't need in order to maximize and cop the most benefits of that. So I don't really think there is a problem to begin with. Lastly then, on the changes in land use. I think firstly they tell you that either you use your land more effectively or you simply sell it. They lose on both. Firstly, on whether or not you use land more effectively. Either you are so rich that you don't care about like the current harms of like rates and whatever, in which case on their side of the house, you probably don't care about a land value tax either. Or we tell you, and so then you're likely, and you have to have like extra properties to rent out, which the poorest who are going to be affected most by the land value tax actually don't have. But also we tell you that you can't use your land more effectively because it's likely in like obscure places where that is where the bare land actually is, that is not close to schools. There's reasons why people haven't developed it in the first place. But secondly, if you're just going to sell the land, they never told us like why you're likely to sell it to like people who actually need it, other than just based back on their like weird model about tenants supposedly being based on the progressivity or like the income of the tenant. I think we've proven to you that you're likely to sell it to the person who is like has the most interest in property, who is an overseas property developer, and you lose that connection once again and all the money goes overseas. But furthermore, there are unique harms to the changes in land use when you have a land tax. We told you about the commercialization of a culture and the commercialization of land when people have to do that in order to maintain their land. Or secondly, we tell you that they just end up having to sell that land anyway. This exists in New Zealand, but in many indigenous cultures throughout the world, but we also told you about like it is harmful to climate change and like the fact that you're destroying like less agricultural land and you are losing things like this. I think at the end of this debate, we've explained to you why poor people are better able to buy homes, better able to buy land, better able to maintain the current land that they do own on outside the house. They use it for good things like leverage to gain loans, to progress themselves and develop in society.
I think this week was an excellent speech. I now invite the leader from side Affirmative to come and close today's debate.
I want to do two things in this reply. Firstly, on who sells their land in this debate or who changes their behaviors. Secondly, what is this land likely to get used for then? Firstly, on who sells their land. The only positive push from side opposition today was that poor people would need to sell their land and that can constitute a very large harm to them. They told us that it can harm people who have a lot of land but don't have a lot of income, for instance, to pay off a tax. But secondly, people who don't or who have a very strong cultural affiliation or emotional ties to the land. What did we tell you in response as to why, firstly, these people are unlikely to sell their land in the first place, but secondly, as to why, even if they did sell their land, that would be fine in this debate? Firstly, it was to say that it is very, Firstly, it was to say that land was a very strong indicator of people's income. If you're a poor person or if you're just a person who owns a large amount of land, that's a lot of land which you can rent out to other people to use and develop. And that just means you probably have income overall. That was material we gave you from Sarissa, that land is inextricably tied to how wealthy people are, how capable they are of paying this tax. That meant that people who weren't able to were unlikely to pay off were unlikely to sell off their land for that reason in the first place. But secondly, for people who have cultural affiliations, like emotional ties to the land, we just explained to you that firstly, the progressivism of this tax system would mean that you're probably able to keep onto it to some degree. I was unclear why that was contentious in this debate. It is just a tax system. We make it progressivist. I'm pretty sure that's fair. But even if you don't buy that, I just think these people can sell off parts of their land, for instance. For instance, if you have a strong emotional connection to your family house, you can just sell off the backyard if it's excessively large, and you're able to keep a lot of material from that. It was unclear why that was the direct emotional harm that people would get. Who did we say would sell their land then? Firstly, I want to explain why there was a problem in this debate as to why people hoard excessive amounts of land that we told you. Firstly, it was that there was no static cost to keeping land for excessive periods of time. This is because, firstly, there was no rates in large amounts of areas, but secondly, rates are relatively small in these regions, right? And this is a unique harm that is separate from a land tax. So maybe you can increase somebody's wealth tax, but that isn't tied to the value and the size of their land. Comparatively, if they keep that land on their side, there is no cost to it, so it's okay for them to do that. On our side, we introduce a cost which incentivizes selling off. But secondly, it's just generational, right? It gets passed down from person to person, which means that very few people have access to go into these houses in the first place. That is why there was a problem. And what we told you then is the incentives of these people are to recuperate their costs, which they're able to do by selling off their land for development. I'm going to move on now to explain what this land gets used for. Our push from first was twofold. Firstly, land could get used for housing development. Secondly, land could which was not used for housing, could just be more efficient overall. We heard a couple of responses from side opposition then. Three things. First, they said that housing development happens in inconvenient locations. Secondly, that development happens through multinationals or very wealthy people, which is very bad. Lastly, that development doesn't happen at a high risk. I want to flag that this last part only came out at third neg. I think that's far too late, but also just that these people who develop this land has a lot more money. It's generally quite low risk for them. They're going to develop it personally. Why else was this not enough to flip this material? First, firstly, I think it was just unrealistic, right? Think about how ludicrous their examples got down the road. Obviously, there are homeless people in New York City, so if you develop land in New York City, people are going to go there. But secondly, the benefits to housing were also indirect, right? Because maybe there's housing development in Hawke's Bay, but that just means that a wealthy Aucklander now buys that up, and now their Auckland house that they use for a holiday home can now be rented out for a majority of people, which means that we have things like state housing having freed up space. I think this was really important in this debate, insofar as we just showed that the ways in which housing could be improved on land would just lead to more people having warm homes. But furthermore, the efficiency of this land increased to a greater extent. Maybe you believe that farmers now have to sell half their plots of land, but we just have tax subsidies and other ways to incentivize them to now improve their efficiency, so the harm to their income was small. Alternatively, we just get so much more benefit when people can get warm homes for those reasons proposed.
What was an exceptional speech. We will now turn up the live stream in just a second. In the meantime, I asked the speakers to cross the floor, shake hands. You can just leave the charger out of the wall. And then I would ask everyone to leave the room and let the judges make their call. Congratulations on a great debate, guys.